Wet on wet is the first of several techniques we will be exploring today. Dip your brush in water and paint a section of your paper. Make sure you get an even coating, not too wet so that the water doesn't pool, but wet enough that you can see a nice shimmer across the page. Dip your paintbrush in your base color and paint over the area that you have previously wet. Make sure your wash is nice and even. As long as your paint is still wet, you may go over it. I've chosen to do so because I wanted the background to be slightly darker. Remember, never go over it if it's already started to dry, because that will just ruin your wash. While your base color is still wet, apply your second color. As I'm trying to create some textures, I am just dabbing the second color onto the first color, allowing it to spread naturally. This is a great way to create textures for trees or shrubbery if you're doing landscape paintings. It can also be used for various other techniques. You can then put a second coat once this dries, because it will dry much lighter, and build up your depth with the colors as well as the textures. As you can see, this layer has dried much lighter, but it has lovely natural edges, and you can build upon this with either wet on wet or wet on dry to create more texture and depth. The next texture we will be exploring is damp on damp. It's very similar to the wet on wet technique. However, instead of painting a water square at the beginning, I'm just going directly with the color. This enables me to create the same effect with less water, and therefore my paint will not move as much, but will still have a little bit of movement. The other thing that's different with this technique is I'm not going to go back in with the second color as quickly as I did with the wet on wet technique. As you can see, there's still quite a bit of shine, so I'm going to let it rest. I'm fast forwarding, so you're not going to see the amount of rest time. When the paper has more of a satiny look than a sheen, that is when I will apply my secondary color. If I apply it too soon, then it will move too fast and it'll spread too far. If I allow for it to dry a bit more than I would with the wet on wet technique, then I get a different effect because the paint doesn't move as much, so I will just get some nice edges, but I will not have it just keep flowing out, so it doesn't spread as much as the previous technique. As you can see, now that it is dry, it is much lighter, but it has not spread nearly as much as the wet on wet. At the end of this video, I will show you a comparison of the two side by side. The third technique we're going to explore today is spatter. It's a very fun technique. There are many ways you can apply spatter. The first method I'm doing is using a number 12 round brush, and I am dipping it in my paint and taking 2 fingers and tapping the brush on top just behind the ferrule. This gives you a nice big spatter, but you don't have as much control. As you'll see, mine's going a little bit on a diagonal and a little bit heavy centric. In the next method, I'm using a fan brush, which I have cut a couple of chunks out of. This is an old brush I had. I am now tapping the brush onto my fingers to create a spatter. It gives a bit more movement, but still there's not as much control. I'm also trying with the 2-finger on top method. For my final example of spatter, I am using a baby toothbrush. This is one of my favorite methods because I have the most control. I can also do a very fine mist, or I can raise my brush away from the paper and get a much larger mist. You just create the spatter effect by running your thumb along the bristles of the toothbrush. As you can see by the various examples, some are very fine, some are larger. It just depends how far away you are from your paper and what type of brush you use. For the dry brush technique, I'm just taking an old bristle fan brush in which I've cut some chunks out of. It creates lovely lines. You can also do this with just an old bristle brush, or you can take your regular watercolor brush, press just below the ferrule on the belly of the brush, and your bristles will separate and you will get the same sort of effect. Just be sure when you're done, dip your brush into the water and reshape it to a nice point. Another great way to get texture in your painting would be by using a technique of lifting out your paint. I'm just drawing in where I'd want some rocks, and I'm going to lift out where I want the highlight. I'll take my brush, dip it in water. I'm using a round number 12, and I'm just dragging it along where I want the highlight to be on my rock. I wipe it out on a tissue. I will then wet my brush again and go over the same area. Do not rub your brush back and forth, because then you will get your paper so wet that you may actually tear it. If you just keep going back and just pulling along the same area, you should get a very nice highlight. If you would like your highlight to fade out, you can just go below it and overlap the previous line and just do 1 or 2 strokes for a lift. Don't keep going so that you're picking up too much paint, and then you'll get the subtle blend into your rock or into your bush or whatever it is you are painting. Lifting out with your brush can be used in a variety of ways. It can create highlights. It could give you the snow caps on a mountain. You can use it in a background to give some subtle suggestion of trees in the fog. You can use it if you have done something a little too dark and you just want to lighten it up, or if you've got a little spatter that you didn't want there, you can lift it up gently as well. You can change the effect by changing your brush size or how many times you go over one particular area. This technique of lifting out is also very good for creating the moon, the sun, getting sunbeams through a forest, putting highlights on leaves, or across a roof line. The second way of lifting out I'm going to demonstrate is by using water and a tissue. Just spray the area that you would like to have the paint lifted out. Let it sit for a couple of seconds. Then take your tissue and gently dab. This is a great way to create clouds in a sky or a mist. All you have to do is gently dab it, and then if you want it to be more significant, you can spray a little bit more water and go back in with clean tissue and re-dab. Again, it is very important that you don't take the tissue and rub it on the paper, because this will just tear your paper and ruin your painting. As you can see here, I am just taking the tissue and I am just lifting the water that is outside of my image, just so that I don't have excess water there. I am not rubbing the paper, I am just touching it and gently pulling it along. When I first added water, I did it with a spray bottle. Now I'm showing how you can do it if you just dab some water on with your brush and you still use the tissue to lift it out. By using a brush to apply the water, I have more control as to what area will be actually lifted out when I come back with my tissue. The last texture I'm going to show you today is Scraffito. As with all the previous textures, I have previously painted and let my base color dry completely. I'm now going over it with a contrasting color, and I'm going to just let that color sit for a couple of seconds, and then I'm going to test it out. I will be using either a palette knife or a knife to gently lift the paint. If the paint starts to go back in on itself, it means that your layer of paint is still too wet and you have to give it a little bit longer to dry. You are not actually scraping the paper with your palette knife or your knife. All you want to do is be able to pull and move the paint. Scraffito is great for creating some textures and depth in your painting. As you can see, my paint has gone back in on itself, so I'm not really seeing the color behind my secondary color. So I'm just giving the image a little longer to dry, then I'll go back in with my knife, and now you can see as I pull it, you can see more of the background color coming through. So I'm going to continue, and I'm just going to draw a bunch of different lines and patterns on here just to show you what sort of effects you can get with Scraffito. By using the edge of my palette knife, I can get a really good effect for grasses that I could have in the foreground of a painting. By changing the angle, I can get thicker lines or thinner lines. I don't normally create a whole scene with Scraffito, but I'm showing you what you can do. Then you can let it dry and you can come back and paint more images on top of it and create more depth. I'm showing you the wet on wet and damp on damp next to each other so you can see how much the paint spreads. Please be sure to hit the subscribe button if you would like to see more of my videos. Be sure to ring the bell if you'd like to get notifications when I post new videos. Thank you for watching.